The Wyoming plain does not forgive. It simply waits. A dead railroad spur in October. 2 rusted tracks ending in nothing. A yard of hard-packed gravel and the gray shapes of buildings that stopped being buildings years ago. And at the very end of the line, 1 boxcar, iron-plated, paint bled down to rust. Sitting on the dead track the way something sits when it's been left rather than forgotten. When someone put it there on purpose, the door is welded shut, not locked, welded. An ugly bead of old iron run the full length of the seam, applied by a hand working fast, working permanent, working from the inside. 30 years ago, a young woman in a gray dress stands alone in the yard, $2 in her coat pocket, a brass compass that belonged to her father, a bill of sale for $4, still warm from the auctioneer's table. She puts both hands flat against the iron. She has no idea what is inside. Neither do we yet. She was 21 years old on the morning everything ended, and she owned exactly 2 things that mattered. One was a brass surveying compass in a cracked leather case, the needle worn smooth at its pivot from decades of use, the case itself darkened by the oil of hands that were no longer alive to hold it. The other was the ability to read a room the way her father had taught her to read a ridgeline. Quietly, from a distance, without announcing herself, looking for where the ground was already beginning to give before she committed her weight to it. Everything else had been accounted for. Itemized, priced, returned. The morning had started cold in the particular way that October mornings in Millhaven started cold, with frost pressed against the inside of the window glass, and the specific silence of a house that has never once felt like home, no matter how many seasons you have spent inside it. Margaret had lain still for a few minutes after waking, not from indecision, but from habit. The habit she had developed over 4 years of listening before moving, of understanding the house's mood before inserting herself into it. She could hear Mrs. Pruitt in the kitchen below, the familiar scrape of the cast-iron skillet across the stove grate. She could hear the measured footsteps of Donald Hartwell on the floor between them, each step placed with the precision of a man who had long ago decided where every piece of furniture in his house belonged and saw no reason to reconsider any of it. She had thought, lying there, maybe today is just a day. Maybe he will let it pass as ordinary. He didn't. The summons arrived at 9 in the morning, delivered not by Hartwell himself but by Mrs. Pruitt, who knocked at Margaret's door, with the careful neutrality she brought to every task that required her to serve as the medium between the household's employer and its least explicable resident. Mr. Hartwell would like to see her in his office when she was ready. This was the household's careful translation of immediately, and Margaret had been in this house long enough to understand the vocabulary. She dressed without rushing. She pulled on the gray wool dress that fit her properly, the one she had mended twice at the left sleeve without ever mentioning it. And she laced her boots methodically, left then right, the way her father had insisted on doing things in order, because order was not a luxury, but a discipline that kept you functional when everything else was failing. She took the compass from the windowsill and put it in her coat pocket. She did not examine the impulse. She simply did it. The office was at the end of the main corridor behind a door of dark walnut that was always closed. In 4 years she had been inside it perhaps 5 times. It smelled the same every time. Dry paper, the ghost of pipe tobacco abandoned years before she arrived, and something underneath those things that she had never quite been able to name, some compound of decisions made and accounts settled, the accumulated atmosphere of a room where things were concluded. Finality had a smell. This room had taught her that Donald Hartwell was standing behind his desk when she entered. He did not indicate the chair positioned across from him, which was the first thing she registered. The chair was placed there for a person to use, and he simply did not gesture toward it, and she understood this without requiring it to be explained. She stood. He was 56 years old, her mother's brother, and he looked the way she had always imagined he had always looked, as if his face had decided on an expression in early middle age and had been maintaining it faithfully ever since. Trim, gray at the temples in a way that had been gray for at least the entire duration of her time in his house. His dark suit was pressed, his collar crisp, his hands flat on the desk surface, beside a single sheet of paper that was squared with the desk's edge, as precisely as if he had used an instrument to align it. He said her name. Then, "You've reached your majority. There are matters that need to be settled." He slid the paper across the desk. She looked at it. It took a moment to understand what she was seeing, because her mind arrived at the correct explanation slightly before she wanted it to. The paper was an invoice. There was no other word for it, and she did not try to find one. It was a document organized in columns, dates in one, descriptions in the second, amounts in the third. 4 years of dates. Descriptions that included food, lodging, clothing, sundry household expenses attributed to her maintenance. The amounts were specific to the penny, which meant he had been keeping records of this from the beginning, which meant he had always intended to present it, which meant never stopped ringing, which meant that every meal she had eaten at his table and every night she had slept under his roof had been logged in a ledger she had never seen, accumulating toward this morning the way interest accumulates when no one is watching. The total at the bottom was a number she had to look at twice. She had read it wrong the first time in the direction of optimism. She looked at it again. It was real. She could feel the room's temperature differently now. Not colder, simply more present, more physical, as a space announces itself when something irreversible has been said inside it and the air has absorbed it and cannot release it. "This is what your maintenance has cost my household," Hartwell said. His voice was exactly what it always was. It was the voice he used to discuss commodity prices over dinner, even in its register, traveling without inflection between subjects as if they were all of equivalent weight. "Over the 4 years since your father's death, the accumulated costs have been considerable. I believe it's fair that you understand the honest accounting of what has been provided to you." She did not say anything for a moment. She was reading the invoice a second time, not expecting the number to change, but needing somewhere to direct her eyes, while she made decisions about her posture and her voice, and the 17 things she was not going to say. The compass was in her coat pocket. She could feel its weight against her hip. Solid, small, a fixed point when everything else was doing arithmetic. "You're presenting me with a bill," she said, not a question. A statement of what was happening, said aloud to confirm it was occurring in reality and not in some extension of the morning's exhausted mind. "I'm presenting you with an honest accounting. The distinction matters. I was 17 when I came to this house." Yes, he did not look away. He looked at her with the pale gray eyes that were the same eyes as her mother's side of the family, except that her mother had done entirely different things with identical equipment. Had laughed with those eyes, had let warmth move through them, had used them to close distances instead of maintain them. "And I chose to take on the responsibility of your care, which I have honored fully and without complaint. Now that you are of legal age, the nature of that responsibility changes. I find that reasonable." She thought about the various responses available to her. She measured them the way her father had taught her to measure slope, from the base upward, looking for where would the ground bear weight and where it would yield. None of the available responses would change number at the bottom of the invoice. None of them would alter what this room already contained, which was the conclusion of an arrangement she had been living inside without understanding it was an arrangement and not a household, a transaction and not a family. He continued, "I'm prepared to forgive this debt in its entirety." The word forgive occupied the room for a moment, in a way that had nothing to do with generosity. "In exchange, I'm asking only that you accept a train ticket west on the Wyoming Central Line and $10 as a relocation allowance. I believe that's more than fair as a foundation for establishing yourself." He placed 2 items on top of the invoice as he said this. A folded train ticket and 2 $5 bills. "I expect you'll want to leave today." She looked at the ticket and the money. She looked at the invoice. She looked at the number at the bottom of the invoice, one final time. The number that represented 4 years of her life, rendered in the currency of his patience with her existence. And she understood that this was not cruelty in the way that required emotion to execute. This was accounting. He had looked at her and seen a column that needed closing, and he was closing it with the efficiency and care he brought to every column. She picked up the train ticket. She picked up the 2 $5 bills. She left the invoice on the desk. She left it face up. She had considered taking it, as a record, as evidence of something, but she decided that leaving it was the correct choice. Let it stay in this room that smelled of settled accounts. Let it occupy his desk after she was gone. Let it be the last thing that existed between them, uncollected, unreturned, a testament to what it had cost him to say what he had said in the exact manner he had chosen to say it. "I understand," she said, 2 words. She had been holding 17 other sentences behind them, and she released none of them. They were hers. He had not earned them. She turned and walked out. She packed her trunk in 40 minutes. The efficiency was not performance. It was the result of 4 years of understanding, at some level below conscious calculation, that none of the things she was packing were actually hers in the sense that mattered. They were objects she used. They were materials she occupied temporarily, The gray wool dress she was wearing was hers, in the sense that she had mended it, and it fit her body, and no one else would wear it. The other dresses in the trunk were hers, in the same diminished sense. She folded them and put them in without ceremony. Her mother's locket she retrieved from the drawer, where she had kept it for 4 years under winter stockings, which was the drawer she had chosen on the second night in this house when she understood that she needed a location for the things that were genuinely hers, and that the location should not be visible from the doorway. She held the locket for a moment without opening it. She knew what was inside, the oval photograph of her mother at 23. The expression in the photograph, the same one she had been told about for her entire childhood, the one that meant she was about to say something that would make everyone in the room laugh. She put the locket in the inner pocket of her traveling coat. Her father's field book, the surveying notes from his working seasons, the pages covered in pencil entries and margin drawings of ridgelines and drainage cuts, and the measurements he had taken in conditions she could only approximate, went into the trunk's flat pocket. She had read sections of it so many times that she knew certain pages by their diagrams, could feel which drawing was on which page by the way the pencil had indented the paper. She was not going to commit it to the bottom of the trunk, because the bottom of the trunk was not the right relationship for something she needed near her. And the compass, she put it in her coat pocket instead of the trunk. She wanted it on her person and not stored away. She looked around the room when the trunk was closed, the iron bed frame, the washstand with its ceramic basin, the window with its view of the back garden, the cottonwood at the corner of the fence line beginning to go yellow at its highest branches. She had looked at this view every morning for 4 years, and she felt nothing in particular about leaving it, which was information of its own kind. She carried the trunk to the hallway, and then down the stairs, one step at a time, without asking for help because there was no one to ask who would have offered it appropriately. Mrs. Pruitt watched from the kitchen doorway with the expression of a woman who had expected something like this and had not been wrong to expect it. She did not speak, and neither did Margaret. The silence between them was not unkind. It was simply the silence of a situation that had run to its conclusion and left nothing useful to add. The station was 8 minutes' walk from the house. She managed the trunk with one hand on its handle and one hand periodically touching the compass through her coat pocket, not from superstition, but from the comfort of consistent weight. Millhaven arranged itself around her as she walked through it for the last time. The painted storefronts on the main commercial block, the bank building with its corner entrance and its painted sign, Hartwell Savings, Est. 1859, the organization of the whole town, proceeding outward from that sign like the spokes of a wheel from its hub. She had spent 4 years inside that arrangement. She had understood it as a place with a center that was Donald Hartwell's reputation, and a circumference that was defined by his lending decisions, and she had understood that she occupied no meaningful position within that arrangement, and that it would not miss her, and that she would not miss it. What she had not understood until this morning was the specific nature of what the center was built on, and she thought about that while she walked to the station, not with the intention of doing anything about it yet, but because it was the kind of thought that arrived and did not wait for invitation. The strips of land. His account book, which she had read in the winter of her second year in his house, sitting at his desk while he was in Cheyenne for 3 days. Reading it not to steal anything but to understand the shape of a man who never explained himself directly. The land acquisition records had been in the back of the ledger, 6 pages of parcel descriptions and purchase prices and dates. She had looked at them briefly and moved on because she did not yet have the context to understand what she was seeing. The prices had seemed low, she remembered. She had noted it and filed it and moved on. She had the context now. She just did not know what to do with it yet. The station platform was empty, except for a station master who looked at her once and then at the schedule board, and then at a point somewhere between these two objects that required his attention more than she did. She set her trunk down and stood with the compass in her palm, case open, the needle settling north with its characteristic unargued authority. The train was visible in the distance, a shape against the October sky, with a thin line of smoke above it. She watched it come. She did not look back at the town behind her. There was nothing to look back at that was hers. She was carrying everything that was hers. The train arrived. The seat she found was in the second-class car, wooden bench, the window pushable to about 2 inches for air. She stowed her trunk in the rack overhead and sat down and watched Millhaven disappear behind a curve in the track, in approximately the time it took her to open the compass case, confirm north, and close it again. The landscape west of Millhaven was, for the first hour, the landscape of Donald Hartwell's holdings made visible, fenced pasture in good condition, cattle in groups that indicated regular management, farmhouses set at measured distances from the road with smoke beginning from their chimneys. She watched the fences pass and thought about the land acquisition records in his account book and about the prices she had noted as low and had not understood. She understood them now, or thought she was beginning to. A man who knew that a company was about to become worthless. A man who knew because he intended to make it worthless, could buy the land that company had made valuable at a price that reflected its apparent worthlessness rather than its actual potential. You made the thing cheap, and then you bought the cheap thing, and you waited for someone else to restore its value. It was a long patience. It was the kind of patience a man like Hartwell had in large supply. She turned away from the window when the last fence line had given way to open plain, the grass pale and dry, the sky at its midday shade of thin Wyoming blue. She took her father's field book from the trunk's flat pocket and opened it to a page she returned to often, near the back, where he had written in the careful hand he reserved for formal notes. A grade does not care about your plans for it. It is what it is. Your job is to understand it accurately, not to argue with it. She read it once and put the book away. The second hour passed in the kind of silence that accumulates when the other passengers have, one by one, departed at small junctions and left the car to its own atmosphere. A man with a grain sack. A woman with 2 children, the children watchful and quiet in the way of children who have learned that travel requires patience. Both gone by early afternoon. By midday the car held perhaps 4 people, and all of them were attending to their own concerns with the mutual courtesy of strangers who have accepted proximity without requiring conversation. Margaret was thinking about money, specifically about $10 and the various distances it could be made to cover. She had the ticket, which had been Hartwell's purchase and therefore not deducted from her 10, and she had the 10, and she had the contents of the trunk and the co-op pocket and nothing else. She did not permit herself the exercise of imagining that the situation was better than it was. Her father had taught her that the first act of real surveying was accepting the terrain as it existed rather than as it would be convenient for it to be, and she applied this principle now. $10, the contents of a small trunk, a practical education that had no market value in any context she had yet encountered, and the ability to think carefully under pressure, which had value only if the pressure continued long enough for careful thinking to produce a result. It was in the middle of the second day, past noon by the light, that she heard the conversation that changed everything. She had not been listening with intention. The 2 men were at the far end of the car, the conductor on his periodic walkthrough, and a brakeman who had boarded at the last junction. They were speaking in the low, carrying tones of men who have categorized their surroundings and concluded that no one present warrants attention, which was a category Margaret had been placed in, often enough that she had learned to be useful inside it. She kept her eyes on the window and let their conversation arrive. The conductor was discussing a schedule adjustment. The brakeman responded, and then the conversation shifted to a place. A spur line off the main track, an hour and a half ahead. The brakeman was saying that the railroad had finally begun clearing the ridgeline spur equipment, rolling stock that had been sitting in the yard since the line was decommissioned, 30 years or close to it. The railroad was selling off what remained, scrap value mostly. The conductor said it was cheaper to let someone local deal with it than to haul everything back. The sale was either today or tomorrow. The brakeman wasn't sure on the timing. 30 years, the conductor said. Some of that stock hasn't been touched since before either of us was working for the company. The brakeman shrugged. The spur had been dead since the payroll trouble anyway. Then the conversation moved on to something else. Margaret stopped looking at the window. She was looking at the back of the seat in front of her. Payroll trouble. 30 years. Equipment nobody wanted. A sale. A price at a sale of this kind in a dead location, for things nobody had found worth retrieving in 3 decades, would be a low price. She had $10. Low prices were the only kind she could operate with. She turned the possibility over with the same method she would use on any terrain feature. Not committing, just noting, looking for what it might mean without yet deciding what to do about it. She found the conductor on his next pass through the car. Ridgeline spur, she said. Can I be let off there? He looked at her with the compound expression she had catalogued over the course of her life in various forms. The specific mixture of assessment and concern that organized itself on the faces of men encountering a young woman traveling alone in a context they found unusual. She had learned to wait it out without explaining herself more than strictly necessary. Nothing there, he said. No real station. No town to speak of. I'm meeting someone. Flat. No. Elaboration. He looked at her for another moment, then said he would have the brakeman slow the train and pull the step at the Ridgeline junction. He moved on. Margaret sat back. She looked at the compass resting in her palm, the needle moving in small compensations as the car swayed on the track, each time returning to the same point. She had no plan. She had the shape of a possibility and $6 remaining after she counted what the fare would cost her when the conductor came back around. She had her father's field book in the pocket beside her and a ticket to Ridgeline Spur that she was making with her own voice, rather than accepting someone else's destination. Her father had always said, "You find the useful things in the places everyone else has already decided aren't worth the visit." Ridgeline Spur arrived on the horizon as a collection of low shapes against the pale sky, barely distinguishable from the surrounding plain until the train had reduced its speed enough for the shapes to resolve into structures. The brakeman helped her get the trunk down the step with minimal ceremony. And then the train gathered itself and moved on, and she stood in the sun's enormous silence of the high plain, with one hand on her trunk, and let the new environment complete its arrival around her. The silence was a different category than she had experienced before. Not the deliberate silence of a house where disapproval moved through the absence of sound. Not the working silence of a room where someone was concentrating. This was the silence of cessation. A place that had simply stopped. The way a clock stops not from breakage but from being wound down and left unwound. And the whole plain took that silence as its ambient state, the wind moving through the dry grass, adding a continuous low sound that was not quite silence, but was close enough to function as a baseline beneath which everything else registered as absence. The structures were clearer from the ground. A boarding house, its signs still readable from her distance, the hollow rest, the letters weathered from whatever original color they had carried to an approximation of the bare wood behind them. A general store with boards nailed across its windows in the overlapping pattern of someone who had covered large panes with lumber that didn't match the dimensions. A livery stable whose roof had collapsed inward at the east end, creating a profile against the sky like a sentence that has lost its conclusion. 3 or 4 smaller buildings she couldn't immediately classify, storage structures, perhaps, or houses in the final stage of returning to their component materials. At the far end of the dead track, where the spur line widened into a hard-packed yard of rust-colored gravel, she could make out a cluster of figures and the thin, carrying sound of a voice working in open air. She picked up the trunk and walked toward it. There were perhaps 20 men, possibly a few more. She became what she had learned to become in situations like this, present enough to accomplish her purpose, quiet enough not to generate the kind of attention that would require management. She stood at the edge of the group and surveyed the yard. The auctioneer was a man in his mid-50s, with a hat that had experienced several serious Wyoming seasons without being retired, and a voice that had been performing this work long enough to have developed a specific quality she could only describe as professionally accepting. The voice of a man who had sold many things. Nobody wanted too many people who weren't quite sure why they were bidding, and who had long since made his peace with both the materials and the clientele. He was working through items that were, by any reasonable assessment, discouraging. Flat cars loaded with lumber so deteriorated it, flexed visibly when a man tested it with one boot. A stripped, tender car missing its hardware. Rail sections that would require significant effort to be worth what the effort cost. The men in the yard moved with the slow assessment of people who had responded to an advertisement that oversold the inventory. They kicked things. They shook their heads. They bought a few items at prices that reflected an honest understanding of what the materials were now worth. Then Margaret saw the boxcar at the far end of the line. It sat at the track's terminus by itself, and it announced itself differently from everything else in the yard. Not from being in better condition. It was not in better condition. Its iron plating weathered and rust-blotched, its paint reduced to faint suggestions of the deep red it had once been. It announced itself through a quality of solidity that nothing else in the yard possessed. Everything around it was in some stage of dissolution, cooperating gradually, with the process of returning to its component materials. The boxcar had apparently declined to participate in this process. It sat on the dead track with the particular dense presence of something that has been sealed against time, and has, to a remarkable degree, succeeded. The door was the defining feature. She could see, even from where she stood at the edge of the auction group, that the door was different from a closed door. As she moved closer, she understood. It was welded shut. A thick, uneven bead of old iron ran the full seam from the top of the doorframe to the bottom, the work of someone who had not been a professional, but had known enough about the material to make it permanent. Beneath the weld, she could still see the heads of the original door rivets, intact, doing work that had been made redundant by the weld above them. Someone had sealed this car, not locked it, not secured it with a mechanism that implied a key existed and a return was planned. Sealed it with intent and with material that said, "This is not meant to be undone from outside." She was standing beside the car now, close enough to put her hand on the iron plating. She pressed her palm flat against the surface. Cold, rough with rust, the texture of something that had stood in Wyoming weather for a generation. She was not looking for anything specific through her hand. She was establishing contact with the thing she was about to make a decision about. Then she moved to the corners. Her father had taught her to read structures at their connections, which was where every structure either held or failed. She walked the car's length slowly, checking each corner bracket. The lower left one had a line in it. Not a joint, not a designed feature. A stress fracture 3 inches long, running along the bracket where the side panel connected to the floor frame. 30 Wyoming winters and summers of metal expanding against cold and contracting against heat had done what 30 years of sustained temperature change eventually does to a fixed metal connection. It had begun, in its own time, to tell the truth about the stress it was carrying. It was not a catastrophic fracture. The bracket still held, but held was different from intact, and the difference was a point she could work. She stood back. She looked at the door's relationship to the fractured bracket. She thought about force vectors and the difference between attacking a weld, which required grinding equipment she didn't have, and attacking a structural connection point that had already begun to yield on its own. She thought about railroad jacks, which livery stables sometimes kept for maintenance work on heavy wagon axles, and which could apply sustained pressure at a precise point in a way that neither a sledgehammer nor a pry bar could manage alone. She thought, this is solvable. The auctioneer had arrived at lot 47. He turned to the boxcar with the expression of a man discharging a professional obligation he does not expect to be met with enthusiasm. Last item of the day, folks. 1B40 boxcar sealed. Contents unknown. We haven't opened it, and we're not planning to. That particular adventure belongs to whoever buys it. Starting at $5 for the iron weight alone, silence. The men looked at the car, looked at each other, and communicated without language the shared mathematics of the situation. The cost of any conceivable opening process plus transport cost probably exceeded any realistic estimate of what 30 years of sealed storage might have preserved. $4? $3.50? The auctioneer's gaze moved across the assembled men and found, with a slight recalibration of expectation, Margaret standing at the car's side with her hand still on the iron. She raised her hand. $4. Several of the men laughed. Not all of them. 6 or 7. The ones close enough to each other for the sound to carry between them. The laugh of men who find a woman at a scrap auction inherently amusing, regardless of context. She had heard this laugh in various forms throughout her life. She had developed a consistent response, which was to register it accurately and continue. $4 from the young lady. The auctioneer's voice carried a note that was not quite amusement, but not quite neutrality either. The professional register of a man adapting to the unexpected. Do I hear 4.25? Nothing. $4 once. $4 twice. A pause. He looked around with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised years ago. Sold for $4. The rail spike section against the crate made its substitution for a gavel. Congratulations, miss. Come see me when you've worked out what you're doing with her. She walked to his table. She counted out 4 of her dollars. She had 10. The ticket had been separate. She still had 10. 6 remaining after this. She took the bill of sale, a handwritten receipt in the efficient script of a man who had produced a great many of them, and folded it into her coat pocket beside the compass. $6 left. A sealed iron box she couldn't open. A dead spur yard in the middle of a Wyoming plain. A bill of sale with her name on it. She turned back to the car and put both hands flat on the iron plating. She was 21 years old. She had been cast out of a house with $10 and a ticket to nowhere in particular. She had spent 4 of those dollars on something that everyone else present had correctly identified as a problem. She did not feel relief or triumph or clarity. She felt the cold iron under her palms and the weight of the compass in her pocket and the particular focus quality of attention that arrived when a problem had acquired enough definition to be worth working on. She had work to do before dark. The boarding house room at the back of the Hollow Rest was better than it deserved to be given the state of everything surrounding it. The window had glass, intact, which meant weathertight. She tested the floor in 3 places with her full weight before she trusted it, and it held in all 3 places. The cast iron stove against the north wall was coated in old rust, but the flue pipe was seated correctly, and when she opened the draft, she could see a line of October sky at the top, which meant the pipe hadn't collapsed inside the wall, and then the stove would function. She found a box of coal beside it, dusty but preservable, and made a small test fire with a strip of wood from a broken crate near the door, and confirmed the smoke drew upward correctly. The well pump in the yard behind the building required 2 minutes of serious persuasion before yielding anything, and then produced cold, clear water with the mineral character of deep Wyoming aquifer, iron and limestone, and the taste of things that had not moved in a very long time and were therefore very clean. She drank from her palm and filled the tin cup she found on a nail near the pump. The kind of cup hung in a location like this, because people had always needed it there. She unpacked with the same methodology she had packed. Ordered, each item assigned a position with a reason. The compass went on the windowsill, where she could see it from the bed frame. The field book went on the board she found, laid across 2 stacks of old brick in the corner, which served as a table with enough authority for her current purposes. The locket stayed in the inner pocket of her traveling coat, which she hung on the hook behind the door. She left the trunk mostly loaded because she had not yet decided anything about duration. She sat on the edge of the iron bed frame. No mattress, but the frame was solid, and she had spent field seasons with her father in worse sleeping conditions, and took the compass out of her coat pocket. She opened the case. The needle moved, adjusted, steadied. She thought about the weld from the inside. She had confirmed this in the last light before coming to the boarding house, getting close enough to read the bead's direction as it had cooled. Iron takes a direction when it solidifies, and this bead had run from the interior face of the door toward the exterior, which was the inverse of what it would be if someone had welded the door shut from outside with the intention of returning. Someone had been in the car, had welded themselves in, had made the closure permanent deliberately, in the full understanding that permanent closures from the inside are permanent closures. She would need to open it. She had concluded this while standing at the car after the auction, not from some premonition about what was inside, but from the simpler fact that she had paid $4 for it and had 6 remaining, and was going to need to understand what she had purchased in order to make any decisions about what came next. The method she had identified, the stress fracture in the lower left corner bracket, a railroad jack, a pry bar, required one additional component that she could not supply from her own resources: another set of hands. The jack needed to be operated by someone while she maintained the pry bar angle. The physics required 2 people. She did not want to need help. She had arrived here alone and would have preferred to work alone, because working alone meant the only variable she had to manage was herself. Another person introduced uncertainty and other interests, and the possibility of complications she had not budgeted for. But the jack was heavier than she could operate, while also holding a pry bar at a precise angle, and wanting to work alone did not change the geometry of the problem. She looked out the window at the dead street in the last of the afternoon light. The auctioneer had mentioned, in passing, that there were still a few residents at the spur. Pensioners, he had said, railroad pensioners, which meant at least one person who knew this place and had been here long enough to know what it contained. Tomorrow, she thought, she would find whoever lived here tomorrow. She lay down on the bed frame with her coat pulled around her and listened to the Wyoming wind moving through the spur yard. The cold was real but manageable. The silence was the silence of a place that had been quiet for a long time and was accustomed to its own company. The compass needle held north on the windowsill. The sealed car sat at the end of the track in the dark. 30 years of kept silence inside it, waiting in the way that things wait when they have been left, to wait by someone who intended them to be found. Edward Briggs appeared at her door before she had finished her first cup of water. She had been standing in the doorway watching the light come across the valley from the east in its gradual Wyoming way. No drama, no ceremony, just the factual return of visibility at the pace that the Earth's rotation delivered it to this particular longitude. She had slept get better than the iron bed frame would seem to merit. She was her father's daughter in this as in other things, and her father had treated sleeping arrangements as a variable to be managed rather than a comfort to be secured before proceeding. The man walking toward her along the dead track from the direction of the third house was old in the specific way of men shaped by decades of physical labor, bent at the upper back into a permanent forward angle that the spine had accepted as its resting position, hands that appeared too large relative to the rest of him, a walk that was deliberate and movement, conserving in the manner of someone who had learned long ago that energy spent unnecessarily was energy unavailable later. He was wearing a work coat repaired at both elbows with patches of different fabric, and he was carrying 2 tin cups. Both steaming, he stopped at what he judged to be a respectful distance. He held out one cup. The coffee inside was strong enough to register as a physical event before she had fully raised the cup. Edward Briggs. He said it as a statement, not an introduction seeking reciprocation. I've been living in the third house down 11 years. Railroad pension. He added this last part as simple context, a fact with no emotional charge attached to it that he nevertheless understood was relevant. Saw you at the auction yesterday. Margaret Voss. You bought the sealed car. I did. He drank from his cup. She drank from hers. In the collapsed livery, a bird was repeating a territorial claim against a silence that made the claim sound more ambitious than it probably was. You're planning to open it, he said. Not quite a question, a statement testing its own accuracy. Yes, you know how? She gave him the operational core. I need a railroad jack and another set of hands. He looked at the boxcar at the end of the track without changing his expression. He looked at it for a while, then back at her. There's a jack in the livery, he said. It was buried under the roof collapse. It's there if you know where to look, which I do. I've got a pry bar too, and cold chisels. Belonged to the maintenance crew when this line was working. A pause that had the quality of a man completing a calculation. I'll give you the tools and the labor for a share of whatever's inside. If it amounts to anything worth sharing, he had decided this before he came over. He was presenting terms he had already settled on, not negotiating. She recognized this and matched it. Agreed, she said. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He handed her his cup to hold and turned and walked back toward the collapsed livery without further ceremony. She stood in the morning light holding 2 empty cups and felt, for the first time since the train platform in Millhaven, something that was not relief but occupied the adjacent territory. The specific small ease of a problem that has acquired a shape you can work with. She set the cups down on the boarding house step and walked to the car. She put her hand on the iron and looked at the fractured corner bracket in the morning light, which showed it more clearly than yesterday's afternoon had, the 3-inch line of separation visible now as what it was. 30 years of the material telling the truth about the load it was carrying. She traced the fracture with one finger without applying pressure. She was measuring it. She was reading it. Her father had said, "The grade does not care about your plans for it. It is what it is." She knew what this was. She knew what she was going to do with it. She went to help Edward dig the jack from the livery debris. The railroad jack was buried under 3 feet of collapsed roofing and a section of loft floor that had come down with it sometime in the years since the livery stopped being a working livery and became a slow project of returning to its materials. Edward knew where to look, which saved the hours that searching without knowledge would have cost. He did not excavate randomly. He moved specific pieces in a specific order, working from the outside of the collapse inward, clearing the load-bearing debris before touching anything beneath it, and Margaret worked beside him using the same logic. Understanding what was supporting what before pulling anything, reading the collapse the way her father had taught her to read Wandutzel terrain, which was from the perimeter toward the center, establishing safe ground before committing to uncertain ground. By mid-morning they had the jack free. It was a heavy ratchet model, the kind designed for lifting loaded stock cars at maintenance stops. Its gearing stiff from disuse but mechanically intact, the ratchet teeth clear and the handle socket undamaged. Heavy enough that moving it required both of them. The pry bar was in the same debris pile, along with a canvas roll of cold chisels, in 3 sizes that Edward untied and examined with the slowest tension of someone who knows what they are looking at and is confirming what they expected to find. The chisels were good steel, their edges blunted from previous use, but not ruined. The kind of tool that had been well made originally and would respond to re-sharpening if she had a way to sharpen them, which she did not currently have and would address later. She set up her position at the lower left corner bracket while Edward positioned the jack. She showed him the fracture, traced it with her finger so he could see exactly what she was working with, and explained what she needed: sustained pressure at a specific angle, not sudden force but a controlled crank, increasing the load gradually until she told him to stop or until something gave. He looked at the fracture, looked at the position she wanted the jack's footplate, and said nothing, which she interpreted as understanding. The first attempt failed. She had miscalculated the starting position. Not the physics, which were correct. The fracture was real, and the force vector she had identified would work. The error was in the placement of the jack's footplate, which she had set too close to the corner, causing the force to run up through the intact portions of the structure, instead of concentrating at the fracture. When Edward applied pressure, the bracket groaned with the sound of a whole structure resisting rather than a specific point yielding. She told him to release slowly, and he did. She stood back from the corner and looked at it for a long time without touching it. Her father, when a survey line refused to work out, had a practice he called returning to the instrument, which meant going back to the beginning of the measurement and checking every assumption, rather than trying to correct forward from where the error had already compounded. She returned to the instrument now. She looked at the fracture. She looked at the door's position in the frame. She looked at the door's position in the section. The Stretworth was actually living in this structure versus where she had assumed it was living. The jack needed to be 18 inches further from the corner than she had placed it. She needed the force vector running laterally across the fracture rather than vertically through the frame above it. And she needed the pry bar seated in the fracture itself, rather than adjacent to it, so that the bar was physically inside the separation point and would transmit the jack's lateral pressure directly through the crack. She reset the jack. She seated the pry bar in the fracture with both hands, adjusting the angle by increments until the geometry felt right in a way she could not fully articulate in language, but could recognize in her hands. Her father had called this reading the instrument, meaning the feedback the tool gives you when it is properly placed, a sensation distinct from the feedback of a tool fighting its own position. She held the bar with both hands. "Crank it," she said. "Slowly. Stop when I say." Edward began to crank. The pressure built through the bar into her hands. She could feel the conversation between the jack's force and the fracture's resistance, and the bar that was translating between them, a negotiation conducted in the language of load distribution that her father had spent a career listening to and had taught her to hear. The bracket made a sound, not the general complaint of the first attempt. Something more specific, a tick, then a creak that was localized rather than structural, the sound of a particular place being asked to move rather than an entire assembly being asked to yield. "Keep going," she said. The creak deepened. And then, in the way that structural failure happens, which is gradual in its preparation and decisive in its moment, the corner bracket gave. Not explosively, not with drama, the way a seam splits when the thread has finally carried more than it was made to carry. A quick, complete yielding at the specific point of maximum stress. The corner of the door frame bent outward 2 inches. A line of darkness appeared in the gap between the door and the frame, thin as a blade. She had the pry bar in that gap before the bracket had finished moving. She drove it forward with her body weight behind it, and the gap opened to 3 inches, and then 4. "Hold," she said. She went and got 3 of the cold chisels from the canvas roll and used them as wedges, seating them at different heights in the gap to keep it from closing if the bar shifted. When they were placed, she told Edward to release the jack pressure gradually, and the gap held at 4 inches with the chisels doing the work. She sat down on the running board of the car and let her hands rest in her lap and breathed for a minute. Her palms were marked from the bar. The October air was cold enough that her breath was visible. Edward sat down on a railroad tie. He wiped his face with the cloth from his pocket. Neither of them said anything for a while. The wind moved through the yard and carried with it, faintly, a smell she could not immediately identify, something underneath the cold iron and the rust and the age of the structure, something that had not been in the air before and was in it now because the gap existed. "Tomorrow for the rest," she said. He nodded without looking at her, still looking at the gap in the door, at the thin darkness beyond the chisels. He seemed to be thinking about something specific, but he did not share it, and she did not ask. She went back to the boarding house and spent the evening working through the arithmetic she had been avoiding. The strongbox, if there was one. The gold, if there was gold. The ledger, if there was a ledger. She did not know any of these things yet, and she tried to keep the arithmetic honest by not assuming them. She thought instead about what she did know, which was that someone had sealed a railroad car from the inside in 1855, and that the seal had been intended to be permanent, and that the person who had made it permanent had not come back out. She thought about that for a long time before she slept. The second day, she addressed the two remaining points, where the door's integrity was connected to the frame. The weld bead ran the full height of the door seam, but the door's integration into the frame depended on three structural connections. The corner bracket she had already compromised, the upper left corner where the weld was thickest, and in the center of the door's top edge, the original hanging hardware had been incorporated into the weld. If she could interrupt the upper corner and the top center, the remaining weld sections would be in tension rather than compression. They would be the weak link rather than the anchor, and the door would be free to move even with sections of the bead intact. The upper left corner took most of the morning. The weld there was thicker than at the bottom. The person who had applied it had been working from top to bottom and had put more material into the beginning of the work, before fatigue or urgency had thinned the bead. She had Edward hold a cold chisel at the seam with sustained pressure, while she used the flat back of the pry bar as a percussive tool. Controlled blows at angles she adjusted incrementally, listening for the change in the impact sound that would tell her the chisel was finding the right path through the old iron. It was not forge work. It did not have the clean rhythm of hammer on properly heated metal. It was slower, more improvisational, a conversation with a material that was not cooperating in the manner of a material being persuaded to cooperate against its own grain. Her hands ached by noon. She stopped. Sandra Holloway had appeared that morning, had simply materialized at the boarding house door at 7:30 with a covered pot and a loaf of bread. The arrival of someone who had decided something and acted on it without requiring discussion. She was 54, broad-shouldered, with the posture of a woman who had been carrying things for a long time and had organized her body around that fact. She set the food on the makeshift table, without explanation, and looked at Margaret once, with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but was the expression of someone conducting an assessment and not yet done with it. Then she left. The stew in the pot was beans and salt pork, and it was very good. Margaret ate standing up because sitting down in the middle of the day felt like a concession she was not ready to make. She returned to the car in the early afternoon and spent 2 hours on the center of the top edge. This required more precision than the upper corner because the door itself, which she still needed to swing outward in one piece when the moment came, had to remain structurally intact while the connection to the frame was disrupted. Choosing the breakpoint wrongly could compromise the door's own integrity, which would make it harder to move rather than easier. She made 3 attempts at different positions before she found what she was looking for, a place in the weld bead directly above the original frame connection where the iron had a pre-existing flaw in it, a microscopic seam within the weld that the person who had applied it had sealed over but not eliminated. The flaw was not visible to her. She found it by sound. The change in impact resonance when the chisel was seated at that specific point, a slightly different report from the metal, the way a hollow space under rock changes the sound of a strike. She drove the chisel into that point and told Edward to apply the full pressure of the jack against the lower corner simultaneously. The door moved 3 additional inches. The door's assembly now fully decoupled winkled from the frame at all 3 critical points. The remaining weld sections, still intact in 2 places along the middle of the seam, now in tension, now the last resistance rather than the primary hold. She wedged the second pry bar into the new gap at the top and put her full weight behind it. The door made a sound she could feel in her chest before she heard it, a low, full groan. The voice of something very large asked to move from a position it had occupied for 30 years. She felt the resistance travel from the door through the bar through her palms, and up her arms and into her shoulders. And she kept her weight forward against it. And she felt the moment when the resistance changed its nature, shifting from the absolute stubbornness of a sealed thing to the friction of a moving one, which was an entirely different kind of resistance and one she could work with. The door gave. It swung outward. Not smoothly, not completely, but 5 feet of opening. 6. the hinges protesting the entire distance in a low, sustained sound that was felt as much as heard. A vibration in every iron surface of the car. The remaining weld sections tore as the door swung through its arc, 3 decades of iron giving way at once in a sequence of sharp releases, and then the door was open and the sound was over, and there was silence again. Then the air came. She stepped back from it involuntarily. She had known it was coming. A sealed space for 30 years, the air inside it undisturbed since 1855. But the abstraction had not prepared her for the actual physical presence of it, which was not simply stale but was its own atmosphere, a category of air that had been somewhere she had not, and was arriving now with the full particularity of its provenance. Cold, flat. The smell of old iron and something else, something that had long since completed whatever process it had been engaged in, and underneath both of those things a quality that had no name, in her experience. The quality of air that has not moved in 30 years and carries in its stillness the fact of that stillness. She stood back from the doorway and let it come out. Edward had moved back too. He had his hat in his hands. He did not say anything. He stood at a distance and let the air of 1855 complete its exit into 1885 at whatever pace it chose. She stood still and breathed the open air around it and waited. After 10 minutes, she went to the boarding house for the lantern. She did not enter first. She held the lantern at the opening and let its light do the work of initial reconnaissance, the way her father had always surveyed a difficult terrain feature from a distance before committing his position to it. You looked first. You drew conclusions. Then you moved. The light cut through the interior darkness in stages, and the car revealed itself by layers. The first layer was the crates, stacked against the interior walls on both sides, wooden, bound with iron strapping that had rusted to the strapping's surface but held. Orderly. Not scattered, not piled carelessly, not the arrangement of cargo stored in haste. Someone had placed them with deliberate organization, crates of similar size grouped together, the stacking pattern distributing weight evenly across the floor. After 30 years of abandonment, the arrangement remained what it had been placed as, which was itself a kind of information. The second layer was the strongbox. In the center of the floor, where she had expected it or something like it. This was a secure shipment car, and secure shipment cars were built for this specific purpose. 3 feet on each side, ironclad, bolted to the floor with hardware. She could not see clearly from the doorway, but could infer from the solidity with which the box sat as part of the floor, rather than on top of it. A fine layer of dust covered its surfaces in the undisturbed pattern of dust that has settled and not been touched. 30 years of settling. Nothing had been near it. The third layer arrived last and stopped her. Against the near wall, to the right of the door, a skeleton in the remains of a railroad paymaster's uniform. The clothing had outlasted everything except the buttons. She could see the brass buttons, a row of them down the front of the double-breasted coat, tarnished to the color of old blood but intact, holding the coat in its proper shape, even when there was no longer anything inside the coat that required the shape to be held. The posture was seated, back against the wall, the legs extended, the arrangement of it, not the collapsed disorganization of unconsciousness, but the deliberate positioning of someone who had chosen where they were going to be. One arm was at rest on the floor. The other was extended, the skeletal fingers resting on the surface of the strongbox in a gesture that was too specific to be accidental, too sustained across 30 years, to be anything other than what it had been in the moment it was formed. A reach, a choice to be in contact with the thing being protected at the moment everything else was giving out, between the extended arm and the strongbox, at an angle that put it half in shadow. A small flat object, dark, leather. She moved the lantern and identified it as a book, a small leather-bound ledger, lying on its side, the cover darkened with age to a deep brown that was almost black. Edward Briggs was in the doorway behind her. He had not crossed the threshold, and he did not speak. He had his hat in both hands, and he was looking at the figure against the wall, with an expression she could not read from her angle, which was the expression of someone who was not surprised, but was finding the confirmation of something they had long suspected to be different from the suspicion itself. She looked at the skeleton for a moment. She looked at the brass buttons and the careful position of the hand and the small ledger and the 30 years of dust that had settled uniformly over all of it. She thought about the weld on the interior face of the door. She thought about what kind of decision that was, and what kind of person made it, and what the person had been trying to accomplish by making it. She stepped into the car. The floor was solid under her boots. The dust rose in small, slow clouds with each step. She walked carefully, not from uncertainty about the floor, but from an awareness that this space had been undisturbed for 30 years, and that the disturbance she was bringing into it was the first, and should be treated accordingly, the way you treat first entry into a survey area, with attention and with the understanding that what you see now is what the place was before you arrived, and that once you have been here you can no longer see that. She crouched beside the ledger. She looked at it without touching it for a moment. At the cracked spine, the darkened cover, the edges of the pages visible at the side still intact, the ink inside preserved by the dry, cold air of 3 decades of sealed storage. She picked it up. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting had faded from black to a deep brownish gray, but was legible, carefully, deliberately legible. The hand of someone who had understood that legibility was not a stylistic choice but a functional one, that the purpose of writing something down was defeated if the writing could not be read. No flourish, no abbreviation. Each letter formed with the patience of a man who understood that what he was writing was meant to be read by someone he would never meet, and who would need to read it correctly. Wyoming Central Line. Payroll shipment, August 14, 1855. Paymaster, George Whitfield. She read it twice. She turned the pages. The subsequent pages were columns. Names in the first, towns of origin in the second, amounts owed in the third. She turned through them slowly, running her thumb down the edges, not reading each entry but taking in the scope. Dozens of names per page, multiple pages. Workers listed with the specificity of someone who had understood that each name was a person, and each person had a town they had come from, and an amount they had earned, and that the precision of the record was a form of respect for the reality it described. The amounts were not round numbers. They were calculated amounts, down to the cent, the kind of figure that results from multiplying a daily rate by an exact number of days, and adding any applicable adjustments for specific tasks or conditions, the kind of figure a paymaster arrives at who has done the work correctly. She reached the back of the ledger. Between the last page and the back cover, tucked with the care of something placed to be found, was an envelope. The envelope was sealed with wax, a dark disc that had held its shape for 30 years in the dry air of the sealed car. The handwriting on the outside was the same careful hand as the ledger of entries, the same letter forms, the same deliberate legibility, the same understanding that this was meant to be read by someone unknown. "To ever finds this." She sat back on her heels in the dust of the floor and held the envelope in both hands and felt the weight of it, which was the weight of paper and wax, and nothing else physically, and was considerably heavier than that in every other respect. She looked at the extended arm of the skeleton resting on the strongbox lid. She looked at the brass buttons of the uniform. She looked at the neat stacks of crates against the walls, organized with the care of someone who had organized them, knowing he would not be there to reorganize them if they fell. She broke the wax seal. The letter was 2 pages, written in the same hand as the ledger, and she read it once quickly and once slowly and then a third time with the complete attention of someone who understands that every word of what they are reading is going to matter for a long time. George Whitfield. Paymaster wrote, "On the night of August 14, 1855, the train carrying this payroll was stopped by armed riders at Pell's Crossing, 12 miles north of the Ridgeline Junction. The riders wore masks. I had been suspicious for several days preceding the robbery. The location was too precisely known, the timing too aligned with the shipment's specific schedule, the method of stopping the train too practiced for men who had not been briefed on the route, and the timing from inside the company. During the robbery, I heard the lead rider speak for the first time. He spoke to the other riders with the fluency and authority of an educated man accustomed to command, using vocabulary and operational concepts that did not belong to a hired outlaw. I had heard this voice on 3 occasions in company offices in Cheyenne. The last time I heard it, it had been explaining the Wyoming Central's land acquisition strategy to a group of department heads. The voice belonged to Donald Hartwell, Vice President of Land Acquisition for the Wyoming Central Line. I did not open the car. I refused to open it. The riders attempted to force the door for approximately 2 hours. I believe they expected me to yield before that interval and were not adequately prepared for sustained resistance. Eventually, they gave up. I heard them making arrangements to divert this car to the Ridgeline Spur, which was already scheduled to close within the month. I believe they intended to return for the shipment at a time when the immediate scrutiny of the robbery had passed. I believe they did not expect to be prevented from returning. I used a portable field forge from the equipment crate. This is listed as item 14 on the manifest on page 23 of this ledger, to weld the door from the inside. I understood when I did this that it was a permanent choice. I made it because the alternative was to allow Hartwell to complete what he had begun, which was to steal the wages of every man listed in this ledger and use that capital to purchase the railroad corridor land that the company's own construction had made valuable. The payroll account would be recorded as emptied by outside robbery. The workers would be told the company had nothing to pay them. The resulting financial disruption would bankrupt the company, and Hartwell would emerge, after an appropriate interval, as the primary holder of the most valuable land in Wyoming Territory, having purchased it at the price of worthless land in the period when the company's collapse had made it appear worthless. I was a paymaster. My function was to ensure that the men were paid. I am asking whoever finds this to complete that function on my behalf. Every name in this ledger earned the amount beside it. The amounts are correct. The company's official payroll records, wherever they exist, will not match this ledger. The discrepancy between what this ledger records and what the official accounts show is the evidence of Hartwell's scheme. He had access to both sets of records. He altered the official accounts before the robbery to prevent the stolen amount from appearing as a loss. He is a careful and methodical man. He was not careful enough to obtain and destroy the original payroll calculation, which I have transcribed in full on pages 8 through 11 of this ledger. The two versions of the accounts, placed beside each other, are the proof. See that the men are paid. I was an honest man. I hope that was enough. George Whitfield, Paymaster, Wyoming Central Line, August 1855. She read the letter 3 times. She sat in the dust of the car for a long time after the third reading, the letter in her hands, the lantern light amber around her, the smell of the old air still present at the edges of the space, the sound of the opened door admitting the October wind from the Wyoming plain in a low continuous note. Edward was in the doorway. He had not spoken since she entered the car. He was looking at her rather than at the skeleton, which she registered without looking up from the letter, and she understood from the quality of his attention that he was giving her whatever she needed from this moment, without requiring her to name it or account for it. The name Donald Hartwell, Vice President of Land Acquisition for the Wyoming Central Line, her mother's brother, the man who had handed her a train ticket and $10 48 hours ago with the efficiency of a man closing an account that had been running longer than he found convenient. The man whose land acquisition records she had read in the back of his account book 3 years ago, the strips of parcels along former railroad corridors purchased at prices she had noted as anomalously low and had filed away without the context to understand. She had the context now. She understood the prices now. She understood why the land had appeared cheap and who had made it appear cheap and by what method. She understood the shape of a man she had been living beside for 4 years and had read as cold but legitimate, as calculating but honest. And she understood now that she had been half right. She was holding the proof of the other half in her hands. She closed the letter. She folded it along its original creases. She placed it back in the envelope. She looked at the strongbox in the center of the floor. The exterior hinges were visible even in the lantern light. Heavy iron straps, riveted to the body of the box, the same structural logic as the door but smaller in scale. The lock on the front face was substantial, but the lock was irrelevant, because the hinges were on the outside, and a hinge is not a lock. It is a connection point, and connection points could be addressed the same way every other connection point in this car had been addressed. With patience, and the right angle of force, and the understanding that nothing is actually sealed permanently, only sealed beyond the effort that most people are willing to put into opening it. She would address the strongbox tomorrow. She needed to think first. She stood and the dust rose around her ankles, and she walked out of the car into the afternoon air, which tasted of everything the air inside the car had not, and she kept walking past the yard and past the edge of the spur line until she was standing on the sage flat where the dead track met the open plain and the land spread west to the mountains, which were carrying new snow on their upper faces and were indifferent to everything she was currently carrying. She stood there for a long time. She was thinking about the law, about sheriffs and territorial judges, and what it would look like to walk into a law office with a letter from a dead man found in a sealed car that had been sitting in an abandoned yard for 30 years, naming the most powerful banker in a 2-county radius as the orchestrator of a 30-year-old railroad robbery. She was thinking about where those sheriffs banked and which judges had mortgages, and who in the territory's legal apparatus had borrowed money from Hartwell's savings in the decades since Hartwell had built it on the capital he was not supposed to have. She was thinking about what a 21-year-old woman with no family and no established standing looked like when she walked into that apparatus with an accusation extorted against a man who had spent 30 years becoming the architecture of the region's financial life. She was thinking about George Whitfield, who had not addressed his letter to the sheriff. He had addressed it to whoever finds this. He had not assumed a legal proceeding. He had assumed a person. He had laid out the evidence and asked for the specific act. See that the men are paid. Not prosecute Hartwell, not go to the law. Pay the men. The act of payment was its own record. A paid worker signed a receipt. A receipt was a document. A document was a fact. Enough facts, signed and dated and witnessed by enough named, identifiable people in enough different locations. That was not an accusation. That was a ledger. A different kind of ledger from the one she was holding under her arm, but constructed on the same principle. Accurate, complete, honest down to the cent. Hartwell had built his world on paper. She had spent 4 years learning how his paper worked, reading his accounts without his knowledge, understanding the language of transactions, not because she had intended to use it, but because it was the language of the only environment she had. She knew what a signed document meant. She knew what a collection of signed, witnessed, dated receipts from named individuals in multiple locations constituted. Not a story, not an allegation, a record. She turned back toward the spur. When she reached the car, Edward was still in the doorway. He looked at her face and seemed to find in it what he had been waiting to find. Some resolution of the thing she had taken with her onto the plane and was now bringing back as a decision. His name is in the letter, she said. She did not say which name, and she did not say which letter. She watched his face and saw that she did not need to. She told him anyway. She told him all of it. The name, what the letter said about the name, what she understood about the land purchases and the bankruptcies, and the 30 years between the robbery and this afternoon in Wyoming October, with the door of the car standing open behind them. She told him without acceleration or emphasis, the way you present a terrain survey. This is what is here. This is its measurement. This is what it means for the route you are planning. He listened. When she finished, he looked at the car for a moment, and then back at her. What are you going to do? A real question. He was asking because his answer to whatever came next depended on knowing hers. Open the strongbox, she said. Find the families. Pay them what the ledger says they're owed. Get a signed receipt from each one. She paused. And I need a lawyer in Rawlins who isn't connected to Hartwell's bank. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard and the car's open door admitted it, and somewhere inside the car it found the lantern she had left burning, and the flame moved and the light shifted. Alderman Pruitt, he said. He's old and half-retired, but he was practicing when the Wyoming Central went under. He was there. He knows what those records look like. A pause. He'll see you if I write him a letter first. Write the letter tonight, she said. He nodded. He turned and walked back toward the third house. She turned back to the car and looked at the open door and the darkness beyond it and thought about a man who had sealed himself inside, with the full understanding that the sealing was permanent, and had then spent whatever time remained to him, writing the names of every person he owed a duty to, down to the cent, in the hope that someone would eventually find it and understand what he had been asking. She understood. The strongbox took the better part of the following afternoon. The exterior hinge straps were countersunk, the pins set flush with the strap surface, which meant they could not be driven out from above. She had to work the straps themselves, getting a narrow cold chisel under each strap at its connection point and applying leverage until the iron fatigued at the rivet heads. Controlled work, slow work. She held the chisel and adjusted the angle with the incremental patience of someone who has accepted that this will take as long as it takes and is not going to hurry the metal. Edward applied force with the 12-pound hammer when she directed and held it when she told him to hold. Sandra Holloway arrived at mid-afternoon with coffee and a plate of biscuits and the manner of a woman who had decided that something she had been adjacent to for a long time was now close enough to be present for directly. She set the food down without comment and stood back and watched without offering opinions, which Margaret recognized as its own form of respect. The respect of someone who understands that the work happening is not theirs to direct, but is something they have a stake in witnessing. The first hinge strap came free at 2:30. The second took another 40 minutes. The third was the most resistant. The lowest strap, nearest the floor, where the weight of the lid over 30 years had compressed the metal at its connection points and changed the geometry she was working with. She had to change her chisel angle twice, reading the resistance in each attempt and adjusting, before she found the line the material was willing to yield along. When the third strap gave, and the lid separated from the box with a sound of final release, she held it closed for a moment with both hands. She was aware of the quality of the silence in the car. She was aware of Edward standing back from the box at the edge of the lantern light. She was aware of Sandra in the doorway, still and attentive. She was aware of the weight of the lid under her palms and the dust on her hands, and the smell of the enclosed space and the sound of the Wyoming wind outside the open door behind them. She lifted the lid. The gold was in rows, velvet-lined compartments fitted to the box's interior dimensions, each compartment holding a stack of double eagle coins, the coins themselves undimmed, their surfaces carrying the quality that gold carries in low light, which is the quality of a material that simply does not change regardless of what surrounds it, or how long it has been surrounded by it. $20 pieces, the standard denomination for large payroll shipments of the period. She counted the compartments with her eyes and estimated the total and confirmed that it was what the ledger said it was. All of it. Every dollar that had been loaded onto the Wyoming Central's August 14th payroll run and had never arrived at its intended destination. 30 years in a sealed box in a sealed car in a forgotten yard, and it was all there. Undisturbed, uncollected. Waiting in the way that things wait when someone has decided. The waiting is worth the cost of deciding it. She did not reach into the box. She looked at the coins for a moment, and then at the letter she had replaced in the envelope and tucked into the ledger's back cover, and then at the first page of the ledger where George Whitfield's name was written in his own hand, and she understood with a clarity that did not require extended thought. This was not hers. It had never been Hartwell's either, which was the entire point. It had always belonged to the names in the columns of the ledger, and to whatever remained of those names after 30 years. The families, the children, the grandchildren, who had grown up in households where a man said they had been cheated and was not believed because the only written record said otherwise. She closed the lid. She looked at Sandra. Sandra said, "I know who the families are, most of them. The ones still in the valley." A pause that was not hesitation, but the pause of someone deciding how much to say at once. "My father is in that ledger." Margaret looked at her. "I know I didn't say that before," Sandra said, before Margaret could speak. "I needed to see what you were going to do first." She said it without apology. It was an honest accounting of a reasonable position. Margaret could not argue with it. "Then you can help me find them," Margaret said. Sandra reached for the coffee pot. "Where do you want to start?" Alderman Pruitt's office in Rawlins was on a side street, off the main commercial block. Its sign, painted in the conservative style of a man who had been practicing long enough that his reputation required no advertisement. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular atmosphere of a space where serious things had been decided across many decades. His desk was loaded with documents in stacks that had their own internal organization, visible only to the person who had created it. He was old in the way of men who have outlasted most of the professional world they entered and are now operating on the far side of their contemporaries, sustained by habit and by the kind of tenacity that is indistinguishable from stubbornness until it produces results. He read Edward's letter. Then he read the paymaster's letter, with the lateral attention of a man, following 2 tracks simultaneously, checking what he was reading against something he was carrying in his memory. He set it down and took his glass off and cleaned them with his handkerchief and put them back on and picked it up again and read the last paragraph. One more time. "I know the Wyoming Central dissolution," he said. "I was practicing when the company went under. I filed 3 claims on behalf of workers attempting to recover wages through the bankruptcy proceeding." He set the letter down with care. All 3 were denied. The official record said the payroll had been taken in an outside robbery. The fund was documented as empty. He looked at Margaret. The fund was not empty. It was here, yes. He looked at the ledger for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter, then back at her. "The Wyoming Central dissolution created a dormant creditor trust under territorial law," he said. "It was never terminated because no valid claim was presented against it after the bankruptcy was finalized. The outstanding payroll liability was listed as irrecoverable and the trust was suspended. That trust is still open. He let this land. If you establish a payment record, signed, witnessed, dated receipts from the named creditors or their legal heirs, you are acting as the executor of a valid trust obligation. The gold in the strongbox is not yours in a personal sense, but distributing it according to the ledger is compliance with a legal obligation, not conversion. What do I need to document? Everything. He said it as a fact, not an instruction. Every payment, every signature, every date, every witness. You need it documented as if it will be reviewed by a court because it may be. He paused. Work quickly. And work in the order that protects the integrity of the record. Start with the people closest to the original workers, the ones whose relationship to the ledger is most direct and least arguable. He spent the next hour with her drafting a receipt template in language that was legally precise without being inaccessible, specific enough to be meaningful in a proceeding and plain enough to be read and signed by someone who had no particular reason to trust a stranger arriving at their door with a canvas bag. She copied the template onto 20 sheets of paper at his desk, using the pen and inkwell he set out, without being asked. When she left his office, she had the receipt forms and a clearer understanding of the legal ground she was standing on and the direction it was sloped. He had read the paymaster's letter, and he knew the name it contained. He did not ask her what she intended to do about the name, and she did not tell him. He was giving her the space to proceed in the order she had determined, which was the order of the ledger, which was the order George Whitfield had used when he wrote it. Name by name, town by town, amount by amount, every person accounted for. On the road back to Ridgelines, she worked through the arithmetic she had been deferring. 211 entries, amounts from $22 to $340 for the senior foreman. 30 years of simple interest at 5% annually. She was not going to compound it. Compounding would empty the strongbox before she reached the middle of the ledger, and Whitfield had asked for the wages, not a windfall. Simple interest at 5% 30 years, applied to each entry individually. She worked the calculations on the back pages of her field book in pencil, checking each figure twice. It was manageable. If she was careful about the order, lowest amounts first, widening the distribution of capital while the strongbox held its majority, she could cover the full ledger. She arrived back at Ridgeline Spur in the late afternoon with 20 receipt forms and a plan, and the understanding that she was about to spend the next several weeks doing the most methodical work of her life, which was also the most important work she could imagine being asked to do. She went to the car and sat at the edge of the open doorway and opened the ledger to the first page of names and read through the columns until she found the entries for the Valley families. The ones Sandra had said were findable, the ones she could reach without letters and waiting. The first name was a stonemason from a town 12 miles north. She closed the ledger and looked at the Wyoming plain turning gold in the last of the afternoon light, and thought about what it meant to be given someone else's unfinished work, and understand that finishing it was the thing you were for. She would start in the morning. The first name on the Valley list was James Calloway, stonemason, Central Division, summer of 1855. His granddaughter was a woman named Pamela Scott, and Sandra had known where to find her before Margaret finished asking, which was the first demonstration of what Sandra's knowledge of this valley actually meant in practical terms. It meant that the work Margaret had anticipated doing alone, tracing names through 30 years of address changes and family movements, and the general dispersal that happens to communities when the economic reason for their existence disappears overnight, was instead work she could do with a guide who carried the map in her head and had been carrying it for 54 years without being asked to use it for anything in particular until now. They drove out in the early morning, Margaret with the ledger under her arm and the canvas bag of coins on the wagon seat beside her, and the receipt forms in the leather folder she had made by folding a piece of harness leather she found in the livery and stitching it with wax thread from Sandra's sewing basket. 6 miles up the valley. The road was a track more than a road, 2 ruts pressed into the hardpan by years of wagon use, and then abandoned to the grass that grew between and through them in the patient way of grass everywhere, reclaiming ground by increments. Pamela Scott's farmhouse had been repaired so many times with so many different materials that the accumulation of repairs had become its own record. Cedar boards from a good year, cheaper pine from a leaner one, the corner post replaced with something that didn't match anything else but held. The window frame shimmed with a strip of iron she had apparently found somewhere and made serve the purpose because it was what was available. Margaret looked at the house, and read it the way her father had taught her to read a structure. As information about the forces it had been subjected to, and the choices that had been made in response to each force. None of the choices perfect, all of them functional. Pamela answered the door with the specific wariness of a woman who has learned that unexpected visitors arrive with complications. She was 43, her hands the hands of someone who did all her own maintenance, and did not organize her work by whether the task was conventionally considered appropriate to her gender, because there was no one else to make that distinction, and the distinction would have been expensive. She looked at Margaret and at Sandra behind her, and then at the ledger under Margaret's arm and said nothing. Waiting, Margaret did not begin with the gold. She began with the ledger. She opened it to the page that held James Calloway's entry and placed it on the kitchen table without commentary, open, so the column was visible. His name, his town of origin, his wages owed at settlement, $112. She said, "My name is Margaret Voss. I've recovered the payroll from the Wyoming Central Line shipment of August 1855. Your grandfather is listed here. I've come to pay what he was owed, plus 30 years of simple interest." Pamela looked at the ledger, then at Margaret, then at the ledger again. The sequence of expressions that moved across her face did so too quickly to catalog completely, but they resolved into something that was not disbelief exactly, but was its immediate neighbor. The expression of a person who wants to believe a thing, and is withholding belief, because the experience of wanting to believe things and finding them not true has been, over the course of her life, frequent enough to produce caution as a reflex. My grandmother said they were cheated, flat, not a question. A statement being tested for response. She was right, Margaret said. The two words occupied the kitchen for a moment, in the way that simple, true statements sometimes occupy a space. Not dramatically, but with a weight that other words don't carry, the weight of a thing that has been known to be true for a long time by people who needed it confirmed, by someone who could confirm it. Margaret placed the canvas bag on the table beside the ledger. Pamela did not move toward it immediately. She was still looking at the ledger, at her grandfather's name in George Whitfield's 30-year-old hand, at the specific figure in the third column. She reached out and placed her fingers on the page beside the entry, not covering it, not touching the handwriting itself, but beside it, as if she needed to confirm the physical reality of the paper before the record inscribed on it could be accepted as real. Margaret opened the bag and counted the coins onto the table in two organized stacks. $112 in principal, $168 in 30 years of simple interest at 5% annually, $280 total, exact. Then she slid the receipt form across the table. Pamela read the receipt completely before she touched the coins. Margaret registered this as significant. A person who reads before signing understands what signing means, and understanding what signing meant was precisely what the record required. She read it to the end, then pulled it toward her, and picked up the pen Margaret had placed beside it, and signed her name with the careful legibility of someone who did not sign documents often, and intended to do it correctly when the occasion arose. She slid the signed receipt back. Margaret dated it and witnessed it and placed it in the leather folder. She stood to leave. At the door, Pamela's voice crossed the kitchen. She died believing it. My grandmother, a pause in which several things were contained. She talked about it her whole life, and people told her she was a bitter old woman making excuses for a man who hadn't succeeded. She wasn't making excuses. She was telling what happened. Margaret turned back. She looked at Pamela Scott across the kitchen and said what George Whitfield had understood when he spent his last hours making sure the ledger was correct. The record was kept right from the beginning. The only thing that was wrong was which record people had access to. She put the receipt in the folder. That was the first signature. Sandra knew the valley. This turned out to be the operational fact on which the next 8 weeks ran. His phone never ringing. She knew which families, across 3 decades, and which had dispersed into neighboring counties and which surnames had changed through marriages that the original names would not have predicted. She knew which of the older residents had clear memories of the summer. Their fathers came home early and didn't talk about what had happened, and which of the younger ones had grown up with the story as family history, told at kitchen tables, repeated at funerals, maintained in the specific oral tradition of people who have been wronged and have no documentary recourse but will not relinquish the truth of their experience, regardless. She knew which doors Margaret should knock on alone, and which would open more easily with Sandra's face beside hers. She knew in 2 cases that a particular recipient needed to hear the story from the beginning before they would accept the money, and in 1 case that a particular recipient would refuse to hear the story at all and would only accept the ledger entry and the correct amount, and a witness who was not a stranger. They moved through the valley systematically. Margaret drove. Sandra navigated. Edward came on the visits where a familiar face was the prerequisite for anything else, and waited in the wagon otherwise, not from indifference but from the understanding that his presence, where it wasn't needed, would complicate what didn't need complicating. Each visit had its own character. A woman in her 60s who had been 11 years as old when her father came home from the Central Division and never spoke about it, who received the money with a stillness so complete that Margaret could not tell, until the woman's hand closed around the canvas bag, whether she was going to accept it or ask Margaret to leave. A man of 50 who read the ledger entry for his grandfather, and then read it again and then said, with the tone of someone correcting a public record, he was a good worker. He built things that are still standing, not to Margaret, to the room. To whatever version of the story had been told about a man who came home with nothing and needed, in the accounting of those who loved him, to be more than the fact of his empty hands. A family of 3, a widow and her 2 grown sons, who had the ledger entry confirmed against a letter their father had written home from the Wyoming Central construction camp, a letter he had kept and they had kept after him, in which he mentioned a paymaster named Whitfield, who kept accurate records and treated the men as if the numbers beside their names corresponded to actual human beings, which the widow said was not always the case with paymasters. She accepted the money and signed the receipt, and asked Margaret where she had found the ledger, and Margaret told her, and the widow sat quietly for a moment and then said, "He was right to trust him." She meant her husband's assessment of Whitfield. She meant it as a final verdict on something her husband had believed, and she had held in trust after him. The hardest visit was a man named Walter Fenn. He was 71, living alone at the east end of the valley, in a house he had maintained with the dogged precision of someone who had decided that maintenance was the form integrity took, when everything else was beyond your control. He listened to Margaret's explanation from beginning to end without sitting down, standing at the center of his kitchen, with his hands at his sides and his face expressing something she could only describe as a considered neutrality. The expression of a man who had made the decision, sometime in the long past, not to want things that might not arrive. When she finished, he said, "Too late," 2 words, his voice without inflection. She did not argue the point. She set the receipt on his table and placed the ledger beside it, open to his father's entry. She set the canvas bag with the counted coins beside the receipt. She said, "Your father earned this. The record was kept correctly when he earned it, and it is being honored correctly now. What you do with it is your decision." She walked to the door, the scrape of a chair leg on the floor behind her, the sound of weight settling into it, the sound of paper being pulled across a wooden surface. She waited with her back to the room, the scratch of a pen, slow. The hand of someone who did not write often, writing carefully. She turned back. Walter Fenn had signed the receipt with the concentrated attention of a man doing something he had decided to do completely rather than partially. He did not look at her when he pushed the signed paper back across the table. He was looking at his father's name in the column of the ledger, at the amount beside it, at the town of origin that was this valley, this place, where he was still living 71 years after his father had loaded up and gone to do work that was never paid for. She took the receipt. She left the coins. She closed the ledger and carried it back to the wagon, and did not speak until they had driven far enough from the house that the distance was its own permission. "How many left?" Sandra asked. Margaret opened the account book. 51 in the valley. 38 outside it, Sandra nodded. She looked at the road ahead. "The outside ones will take longer?" "Yes, but they need to be found, every name," Margaret said. It was not a decision she was making. It was a statement of what the ledger required, what Whitfield had required when he wrote it, what the work was. Every name in the ledger. Sandra nodded again and said nothing else, and they drove back to Ridgeline Spur, in the kind of silence that is not empty, but is the silence of people who have agreed on something important, and do not need to continue agreeing out loud. The letter arrived on a Thursday in the 4th week. It came through the Rawlins postal office, forwarded to her care of Pruitt's address, since she had no official address of her own, and Pruitt's clerk had driven it out to the spur on his weekly supply run without being asked. which was the kind of small efficiency that Pruitt's office apparently provided, as a matter of course. The envelope was good paper. The wax seal was unmarked, a blank disc pressed into dark wax, the choice of a man who had a seal but declined to use it on this particular correspondence. She opened it at her desk in the boxcar. In the early evening, the lantern lit, the compass on its corner, the receipt folder thick with completed signatures beside the ledger. The account book opened to her running tally of payments made and remaining. There was no salutation. The letter began at its subject without preamble. He was aware of the payroll recovery. He had made inquiries and understood the general nature and scope of what she was undertaking. He wrote to propose a settlement, and he named a figure. The figure was substantial, more than the gold remaining in the strongbox at that point, calculated to address the full value of the recovered payroll, with additional consideration for her role in recovering it. He described the ledger and its contents as historical artifacts of a company that no longer had legal existence. He described the gold as recovered proceeds of a historical incident whose perpetrators had never been legally established. He did not mention his own name as it appeared in the paymaster's letter. He did not acknowledge the letter. He wrote around these facts with the fluency of a man who had spent 30 years not speaking about them and had developed the skill to a high degree. He expected a response within 2 weeks. She read the letter once. She folded it along its original creases. She placed it at the bottom of the strongbox, beneath the remaining gold, and closed the lid. She did not respond. She understood that silence was a language Hartwell would read accurately, because he was a man who had spent his career in the language of transactions, and silence in response to an offer communicated something specific in that language. It said, "There is nothing purchasable here." Not because the price is insufficient. He would have understood a counteroffer, would have found a counteroffer legible and negotiable, but because the thing he was attempting to buy did not have a price. The record, the fact, the 211 names, and the amounts beside them, and what it meant that each of those amounts had been stolen and was being returned. These were not commodities. Hartwell had spent 30 years believing they could be made into commodities, made into things that time and distance, and the absence of documentation would eventually reduce to the status of things that no longer mattered. He had been wrong, and the wrongness was complete, and offering money for it now was the action of a man who understood only one kind of resolution, and was applying it to a situation that operated by different principles entirely. His silence, when her silence became undeniable, would cost him something, not dramatically, not in a way that produced a visible event she would be able to mark on a calendar. But the awareness that she had read his letter and chosen not to respond, that she had understood his offer and declined to engage with it on his terms. That awareness would work on him in ways that money could not address, because money was the only tool he had, and the tool was not applicable here. She went back to the ledger and found her place, and continued working. The out-of-valley entries required letters, and the letter required a patience that was different in character from the patience required by physical work. Physical work gave you feedback. When she and Edward had opened the car, every action produced a response. The pressure through the bar, the sound of the bracket, the crack when the door finally gave. You could read the progress. You could measure it. The letters produced nothing for days, and sometimes weeks, and sometimes not at all, and the absence of response was not information about failure, but simply the absence of information, which was harder to hold than failure, because it did not tell you what to do next. She wrote to addresses derived from the ledger's town of origin column, which listed the places the men had come from in 1855, and from the personnel roster she had found in one of the wooden crates in the car. Company records, transport manifests, employment documentation, the organizational archive of a company that had ceased to exist, but had been thorough while it existed. She cross-referenced the two sources, used Pruitt's knowledge of county records from the period to fill gaps, and sent letters that were factual and brief, and contained enough specific information, the ledger entry, the amount, the name of the paymaster, to establish that they were not generic inquiries, but were addressed to a specific situation that the recipient would recognize as real. Some letters came back undeliverable, the address no longer corresponding to any locatable person. Some she sent twice to the same address, and received a reply to the second that had not come to the first, for reasons she could not determine, and did not need to. Some produced replies that were suspicious. People who had been approached before by people claiming to represent historical obligations. and who had learned to treat such approaches as precursors to being asked for something rather than offered something. These required longer letters, more documentation, sometimes a letter from Pruitt on his office stationery as a secondary confirmation that the claim was legitimate. She developed a working method. The morning was for correspondence, writing, addressing, recording in the account book which letters had been sent to which addresses, on which dates. So the record of outreach was as complete as the record of completed payments. The afternoon was for the practical work of the valley, visits still remaining, and for the ongoing management of the strongbox, which she had moved to the boarding house for security and was drawing from in the measured amounts required by each payment, recording each withdrawal in the account book against the ledger entry it corresponded to. The evening was for the arithmetic, verifying calculations, updating totals, maintaining never-stopped record, maintaining the running that would eventually become the full documentation of the trust's distribution. Edward helped with the valley visits and with the physical work of maintaining the spur. There were things that needed doing, structural things, that he had apparently been managing alone for 11 years, and could now manage with an additional pair of hands. Sandra managed the correspondence logistics, which meant knowing which families in the valley had relatives in neighboring counties who might know the whereabouts of people she couldn't locate directly, and then making those inquiries through the channels that her 54 years of valley residence gave her access to. The work was not dramatic. It did not have the quality of the door opening or the letter reading, those moments of compressed significance when everything changed its meaning at once. It had the quality of the ledger itself, methodical, cumulative, each entry complete in itself, and part of something larger that would only be visible when all the entries were complete. She found, in the evenings at her desk with the lantern and the account book and the ledger open beside it, that she did not mind this quality. She found it clarifying. The work required exactly what it required and nothing more, and doing it correctly was sufficient. By the end of the 5th week, she had completed 67 Valley payments and had received confirmed replies to 19 out-of-Valley letters. The leather folder holding the receipts had been retired in favor of a proper document box she had purchased in Rawlins. Oiled leather, brass-fitted corners, the kind of box that communicated to anyone who saw it that its contents were to be taken seriously. She carried it everywhere. One evening, sitting with the account book and the ledger and the steadily growing count of completed entries, she thought about George Whitfield writing these same names in this same order in the sealed car in August 1855, knowing that the writing was the last work he would do, and doing it with the care of a man who understood that the quality of the record would matter more after he was gone than it did while he was present to explain it. She thought about what it meant to inherit someone else's unfinished work, and understand that finishing it was not obligation but purpose. The difference between a thing you do because you have to and a thing you do because it is the right shape for what you are. She wrote the next entry in the account book. She did not stop until the lantern needed refilling. 3 letters to Nebraska, sent to 3 different addresses derived from the personnel roster, and from Pruitt's research into Wyoming's central employment records from the period, seeking any surviving family of George Whitfield. Paymaster. The first returned undeliverable. The second produced no reply. The third reached its destination 6 weeks after she sent it, and the reply came in a hand she did not know, angular and compressed, written on paper that had been stored somewhere slightly damp and carried the evidence of it at the page edges. She was 78 years old, the letter said. George Whitfield had been her father. She had been 8 years old in the summer of 1855, and the last memory she had of him was a specific one. He was leaving on a payroll run, an important one, he had told her. He would be back in 2 weeks. He had kissed her on the forehead. She had watched him walk down the road and had not seen him again. She had been told he died in the robbery. That was the story the company had given. The paymaster had been killed trying to protect the shipment. The robbers had taken everything and fled. The company was ruined. She had been 8 years old and had believed what she was told, because there was nothing else to believe, and had gone on believing it across 7 decades. Because no one had ever given her a reason to believe anything different. She wrote that she would come to Ridgeline Spur if Margaret could have her. She was old, but she was not immobile, and she had been waiting her whole life, she wrote, for something she could not have named before receiving Margaret's letter, and she was not going to allow age to be the reason she did not go to it now that it had arrived. Margaret wrote back that same evening. Come, she wrote. She did not add anything to this. The word was sufficient, and anything additional would have been a diminishment of what it meant. She sent the letter with the morning's mail, and then sat at her desk with the ledger open to the back pages, to the entry she had found there on her first thorough reading, and had been holding since. George Whitfield. Paymaster. 1 month's wages at the company rate for his position. $32. The entry recorded in his own hand in his own ledger. A man who had kept the record accurately enough to include himself in it. She had set this entry aside from the beginning, holding it in a separate cloth envelope that she kept in the document box beside the completed receipts. Not because she had forgotten it, because she had understood that it required its own resolution, and that the resolution was not yet present and she needed to wait for it. The resolution was coming on the train from Nebraska. She closed the ledger. She went outside and stood in the yard in the dark and looked at the Wyoming sky, which at this elevation and in this absence of any competing light was an inventory of stars so dense that the darkness between them seemed incidental. Her father had taught her to navigate by stars as well as by compass. Taught her that the compass told you where north was, but the stars told you where you were in relation to everything, which was a different and larger kind of orientation. She had not used star navigation since his field seasons. She used it now, standing in the spur yard, finding the familiar patterns and placing herself inside them. She was here, at the end of a dead track in Wyoming, 32 years old. No, 21. She kept doing this arithmetic wrong in her tiredness. She was 21, had been 21 when this started, and was still 21 because it had only been 2 months. It only felt like longer because of the density of the work. 21 years old, with $2 and some change remaining from the 10 she had arrived with, and a document box full of receipts, and a letter from an old woman in Nebraska traveling toward her on the train. She went back inside and went to sleep. Agnes Whitfield came down the platform steps of Rollins Station on a Tuesday afternoon in November, with the careful deliberation of a woman who has made a calculation about how to move through the world at 78 and has resolved it in favor of continuing. She was small, white-haired, wearing a dark travel dress that was clean and well-kept, and had been chosen, Margaret thought, with the understanding that this trip mattered, and the clothing for it should reflect that. She carried her own bag. She had not checked it, which Margaret recognized as the instinct of a woman who had learned not to relinquish her belongings to other people's management. They shook hands on the platform. Agnes looked at Margaret directly, in the manner of someone who had been looking at things directly for 78 years, and found the habit too useful to abandon for social comfort. You found him? Not a question. Yes, Margaret said. Was it? A brief pause in which several things moved through Agnes's expression. Was it terrible? The way he was, she thought about how to answer this accurately. She thought about the skeleton in the paymaster's uniform, the brass buttons holding their shape, the careful posture, the specific placement of the extended arm resting on the strongbox lid. Not the collapse of a man who had given out. The deliberate arrangement of a man who had made a choice, and had made it completely. His hand was on the strongbox, Margaret said. He hadn't let go. Agnes closed her eyes. She stood that way for a moment on the platform, the sound of the departing train fading east across the plain, the November light thin and direct on everything. When she opened her eyes, they were bright in the specific way of someone choosing not to do something they could do, holding it back as an act of will. He would have done that, Agnes said. Her voice was clear and steady. That was who he was. She picked up her bag. Take me there. They drove to Ridgeline Spur in the late afternoon light, the valley going gold around them as the sun declined toward the western mountains. Agnes asked questions during the drive, practical questions, the questions of a person who wants to understand the actual sequence of events, rather than a summarized version of them. How Margaret had found the car, how she had opened it, the method specifically. She listened to the explanation of the stress fracture and the railroad jack and the force vector with the attentiveness of someone who valued precision. And when Margaret finished, she said, he would have approved of that. He distrusted improvisation for its own sake, but he believed in reading what was actually there. At the spur she read the paymaster's letter, standing at Margaret's plank desk in the boxcar, holding the 2 pages in both hands, the lantern casting its warm light on the paper and on Agnes's face, and on the compass in the corner of the desk, and on the document box with its brass fittings beside the closed ledger. She read without movement. Both pages, the full text, every sentence of it. Margaret stood back against the iron wall of the car and did not speak, and did not move toward her, and did not offer anything, because this was not a moment that required management. It was a moment that required space. Agnes reached the last paragraph. She read it. She set the letter down on the desk with great care, aligning its edge with the ledger's cover, as if the placement had meaning, which, perhaps it did. Then she put both hands over her face, her fingers pressed to her forehead, and she cried with the specific quality of grief that has been deferred for 70 years. Not dramatic, not performed, but the deep release of something carried so long that the person carrying it had forgotten what it would feel like to put it down. Margaret stood still. She let it complete itself. She had learned in the weeks of valley visits that grief received was not grief requiring management, that the most respectful thing she could offer was to be present without intervening. And she offered it now. After a while, Agnes took her hands from her face. She smoothed the front of her dress. She looked at the letter, then at Margaret. He always said the ledger had to be kept correctly. Her voice had cleared, the weight of the deferred grief released and replaced by something that was almost its opposite, a quality of lightness, of a thing settled. He said a man who kept an inaccurate record had made a decision about which version of reality he preferred, and that was a moral decision, not a practical one. He took it seriously in a way that other people found excessive. A pause. Other people were wrong. His letter gave me the method, Margaret said. Not just the information, the method. Pay the workers. Get receipts. Let the record speak for itself. Agnes looked at the ledger. May I see it? Margaret opened it to the back pages, to the entry held there, and placed it in front of Agnes with the cloth envelope beside it. Agnes looked at her father's name in her father's handwriting, the same hand as the letter, the same deliberate legibility, the same letter forms, shaped by the same hand that had held her as a child. She pressed her palm flat against the page and stayed that way, her hand on the paper, her eyes closed. Then she opened them. She signed the receipt with the same angular, compressed hand as her letter, signing it completely and without hesitation, and she dated it in the space Margaret indicated, and watched Margaret witness it and enter it in the account book. When Margaret counted the coins, $32 in principal, $48 in 30 years of simple interest, $80 total. Agnes accepted the bag with both hands and held it on her lap. She stayed 3 evenings. In the evenings, she told Margaret and Edward and Sandra things about George Whitfield that the Valley had no way to know, because there had been no one to tell them. How he had become a paymaster, which was less a career aspiration than a recognition that his particular combination of mathematical precision and moral seriousness suited him. To work, where the difference between two numbers in a column represented something real about a real person's life. How he had, on witty occasions, refused to approve payroll shortfalls that supervisors had presented as rounding errors. How he had explained to Agnes, when she was old enough to ask, that rounding in the direction of the company was not rounding at all. It was taking, done in small enough amounts, that no one amount was worth disputing, which was what made it the more dishonest rather than the less. On the last evening, Sandra asked what Agnes intended to do with the money. Agnes said, I have a granddaughter who wants to go to a normal school in Columbus. She has been told there is no money for it. She looked at the canvas bag on her lap. There is money for it now. In the morning, Margaret drove her to the Rawlins train station. At the platform, before she boarded, Agnes took Margaret's hand and held it for a moment and looked at her directly. He was betting on a stranger's integrity, Agnes said. He had no way to know whether that bet would pay. He made it anyway, because the alternative was to not make it, and he couldn't do that. She released Margaret's hand. You should know that it paid. Margaret watched the train take Agnes Whitfield east toward Nebraska, and the granddaughter who was going to normal school, and she stood on the platform until the train was a line of smoke against the November sky, and then she drove back to Ridgeline Spur and opened the ledger to the page where she had left off. 41 names remaining. She picked up the pen. She was a woman who kept the record correctly, and there was work still to be done, and she did not mistake the fact of Agnes's arrival and departure for the completion of the task. The completion of the task was the completion of every entry in the ledger, and she was not finished until that was true. The pen moved across the account book page in the familiar rhythm of work she knew how to do. The last out-of-valley reply arrived in December, from a man in Kansas whose grandfather had been a water carrier on the Central Division in 1855. The lowest paid entry in the entire ledger, $22 for a 2-month season, a figure that was small but was not nothing. because George Whitfield had understood that $22 was not nothing to the man who earned it, and had recorded it with the same precision he had applied to the $340 foreman's entry at the other end of the scale. The man in Kansas had not written back to Margaret's first letter. He had written back to her third, the one she had sent after following a chain of forwarding addresses through 2 county postal offices, with a letter that was brief and contained only what was necessary. He confirmed he was who she was looking for. He confirmed his grandfather's name matched the ledger, and he asked her to send the payment by postal draft rather than asking him to travel, which was a reasonable request, that she honored. The draft required Pruitt's assistance to execute correctly, and she drove to Rawlins and sat in Pruitt's paper-laden office and worked through the documentation with him over the course of an afternoon. The receipt form was adapted for the postal transaction, with an additional witness clause that Pruitt added to ensure its legal equivalency with the in-person signatures. She sent it with the draft and a letter explaining the documentation requirements, and the reply came back 4 weeks later with the receipt signed and witnessed by the Kansas man's neighbor and the neighbor's wife, both names recorded in their full forms, dated correctly, the whole thing as proper as any document Pruitt himself could have produced. She placed the receipt in the document box. She opened the account book to the running total. She counted the completed entries against the ledger's 211 names. 211. She closed the account book. She sat at her desk in the boxcar on a December morning with the lantern burning, because the December light through the cut windows was not sufficient until later, and she looked at what was in front of her. The ledger closed. The account book closed. The document box with its brass fittings, holding 211 signed, dated, witnessed receipts. The cloth envelope now empty of the coins that had been in it. The paymaster's entry in the ledger now balanced by a signature in Kansas that confirmed the account was settled. The strongbox in the boarding house was not entirely empty. A small amount remained. The accumulated rounding differences between her 5% interest calculations and the theoretical exact amounts, figures she had been conservative about throughout, always rounding down rather than up in her favor. The remaining amount was not substantial. It was sufficient for what she knew she was going to use it for, which was the ongoing practical needs of the spur and its small reconstituting community, the things that had been deferred while the strongbox served its primary purpose. She was not wealthy. She had not become wealthy in the course of this work, and had not expected to. She had $2 remaining in her personal account and a document box full of receipts, and a boxcar she lived in at the end of a dead track in Wyoming. And these things were different in kind from what she had arrived with, but were not different in quantity in any way that would appear impressive to someone looking at the numbers. But the numbers were not the complete accounting. The collapse of Hartwell Savings did not happen as a single event. It happened as trust collapses, when the foundation shifts slowly enough that no individual moment marks the change. You look back afterward and find that you cannot identify the day when confidence became doubt, only the accumulation of small distances that people began to put between themselves and the institution. A merchant in Granton who had banked there for 20 years moved a portion of his deposits without announcement. A land agent who had done business with Hartwell for a decade stopped returning correspondence at his usual pace. A correspondent institution in Denver that had extended credit lines began requesting documentation on collateral that had previously been accepted on Hartwell's word, which was the financial equivalent of asking a man to explain a joke that everyone had previously pretended to find funny. The receipts had been filed with Pruitt by mid-November. All 211, documented and witnessed, the account book alongside them as a parallel record of the same transactions in Margaret's hand. Pruitt had filed a formal restitution claim against the dormant Wyoming Central Trust, which triggered a territorial review of the dissolution records. The review attracted the attention of a railroad commissioner who had been examining anomalies in land acquisition patterns along the former Wyoming Central Corridor for a reason unrelated to this case, and who found in the ledger and the paymaster's letter a considerably more complete explanation for those anomalies than he had been expecting. Margaret had filed no complaint. She had initiated no legal proceeding against Hartwell personally. She had done exactly what George Whitfield had asked. Paid the workers, kept the receipts, let the record speak. The receipts documented the debt's reality. The debt's reality documented the theft. The theft was documented in a letter written by a man with no reason to lie, in his last hours in a sealed car. The integrity of the documentation, established by 30 years of undisturbed preservation. The story moved through the valley and into the surrounding communities by the only mechanism she had used throughout. Human conversation, the exchange of information between people who knew each other, the way that truth travels when it is not being managed. The families who had signed the receipts spoke to their neighbors. Their neighbors spoke to people in town. People in town spoke to merchants who spoke to creditors, who spoke to the men who had made the decision about Donald Hartwell's credit 20 years ago and were now being asked to make a new decision about it. A bank is a promise. It is nothing else, finally. You deposit your money and the promise is that the bank will behave in accordance with certain principles, the most basic of which is that the man whose name is on the door is the kind of man whose name you can trust on a door. When the promise becomes uncertain, the bank becomes uncertain, and there is no amount of capital that repairs the specific damage of uncertainty. Because uncertainty is not about the capital. Hartwell sold the bank in November, 4 months after Margaret had opened the boxcar. He sold it to a buyer from Cheyenne at a price that reflected the bank's actual asset base, rather than its reputation-dependent value. The price of a bank whose founder's name had become a liability rather than an asset. He sold his land holdings over the following 2 months. The Wyoming Central Corridor parcels, along with everything else, sold in the depressed market of a man who needed to sell rather than the advantageous market of a man who could choose his timing. She did not know the exact figures. She knew the result. A man who had built his position over 30 years on a stolen foundation sold that position for the value of the legitimate parts only, leaving the stolen portion where it had always actually been, which was in the hands of the people it belonged to. He moved east. This reached her in the spring, through the same channels as everything else. He moved east without announcement, and the infrastructure of Millhaven reorganized itself around his absence with the practical flexibility of a place that had other reasons to exist, and simply substituted a different arrangement for the one he had provided. His name remained on the bank building for a few months until the new owners replaced the sign. After that, his name appeared nowhere in the public record of the place he had organized his life around. She had not seen him since the morning of her 21st birthday. She had not responded to his letter. She would not see him again. She understood this without the need to locate it in a category of resolution, because there was nothing to resolve. He had presented a transaction, and she had declined to transact, and the matter was settled in the most complete way a matter can be settled, which is when both parties understand that it is over and neither requires the other's acknowledgement of that understanding. The boxcar, by December, had become a place where light entered from the west in the afternoons and turned the cut windows into sources of something warm. Edward and Sandra's son had helped with the second window, and with the additional stove grate and with the small improvements that accumulated over the weeks as the car became less provisional and more habitual. The plank floor was solid. The sleeping shelf at the far end was simple construction done correctly. The stove drew well in all weather. The space was small and entirely hers. And entirely hers was a category of ownership she had not inhabited before this October and found to be different in quality from anything she had imagined it would be. The spur showed the signs that occur when a small infusion of capital meets a community that has been maintained through stubbornness rather than resources, and is waiting for the point at which maintenance becomes investment. Pamela Scott's farmhouse had a new section of roof, the cedar boards a lighter color than the aged wood around them, the seam between old and new visible and not apologized for. A family that had been considering leaving the valley had decided to stay and was rebuilding the collapsed section of their barn. The general store building, still boarded up, had been entered by 2 men who had spent a Sunday afternoon assessing its structural integrity and had concluded it was sounder than it appeared, and who were now discussing what it would cost to open it as a working store again. These were small things. They were not the restoration of a town. They were the signs that a place has decided to continue, which is different from, and prior to restoration, and is perhaps more important than restoration, because it is the decision from which everything else follows. On a December morning, Margaret sat at her desk with the account book open to the final entry, and the ledger open beside it, and the document box closed on the desk's corner. She had made a small fire in the stove and the car was warm. The December light through the west window arrived at an angle that put a line of gold across the plank floor and climbed the iron wall on the east side as the morning advanced. She took the compass from her coat pocket. She set it on the desk. She opened the case. The needle moved, compensated, settled north, as it had always done. As it had done on the windowsill of the boarding house on the first night at Ridgeline Spur. As it had done in her palm on the platform in Millhaven while she waited for a train she had not yet decided where to board. A compass needle does not negotiate with its environment. It does not take into account the convenience of the direction it indicates. It finds north because north is where north is, and it reports this with the consistency of something that has only one function and performs it without variation. Her father had said, "Everything worth finding starts with knowing where you are standing." She looked at the closed ledger. 211 entries, every one of them balanced. She looked at the account book, every payment recorded in her hand alongside Whitf's original. She looked at the document box holding 211 signatures of people who had confirmed, each in their own name, that a debt had been incurred and had been discharged. She looked at the paymaster's letter, which she had taken from the bottom of the now empty strongbox, and placed on the desk where she could see it. She had not resealed the envelope. The broken wax was still there in two pieces beside the folded paper. She left it that way because she wanted the letter to remain in the condition of having been opened, of having been found, and read by the person it was addressed to. Whoever finds this, because that condition was the completion of the thing Whitfield had set in motion, and closing it would have been the wrong direction. She took the field book from the desk's flat surface. She opened it to the page, near the back, where her father had written, "A grade does not care about your plans for it. It is what it is. Your job is to understand it accurately, not to argue with it." She had understood it accurately. She had not argued with it. She closed the field book and placed it beside the ledger. She opened the new account book. Clean pages, the one she had bought in Rawlins in November with 40 cents of her remaining money, its pages unmarked, waiting for whatever record came next. She uncapped the pen. She had been thinking, through the weeks of payments and receipts and letters and the slow reconstruction of the relationship between what had been done and what the record said had been done, about what came next. Not for herself in the narrow sense of personal circumstance, though that was part of it. For the valley. For the community that was deciding to continue. For the practical fact that a community deciding to continue needed someone to keep its record correctly, to document what it had, what it owed, what it was owed, who held what obligation to whom, in language that was accurate and complete and honest to the cent. She knew how to do this. She had learned from the best possible source. From a man who had kept the record so correctly that it had survived 30 years in a sealed iron box, and arrived intact in the hands of someone who could use it, who had been able to use it because the record was correct, who had been able to complete the work, because the record had told her exactly what the work was. She wrote the date at the top of the first page of the new account book. She wrote the name of the valley. She wrote the year. She began the first entry. She wrote it in the manner her father had always written field notes. Present tense, specific, no interpretation that was not supported by the observed fact. This is what is here. This is what it measures. This is what it means. The morning light moved through the west window and crossed the plank floor and reached the desk and illuminated the open page of the account book, her handwriting dark on the clean paper, the pen moving steadily forward. The compass was open on the corner of the desk, the needle held north without effort or adjustment, finding it the way it always found it. Not by searching, not by argument, not by the application of force, by being the kind of thing that knew where north was and had no interest in being anything else. She wrote until the light was sufficient to extinguish the lantern, and then she extinguished it, and she continued in the natural light of a December morning in Wyoming, which was thin and direct and cold and clear and entirely adequate for the work she was doing. Outside, the valley was making the sounds that a place makes when it has decided to continue. The particular sounds of work that is maintenance becoming investment, of people who have received what they were owed, using it for what they need, of a community that has had a true account of itself, given back after 30 years of operating on a false one, and is discovering what it is possible to do when the record reflects what's actually there. She heard it through the cut windows as she wrote. She did not stop to listen. She was working, and the work was what there was, and it was enough.